Africa is home to tropical rainforests, rugged mountains, fertile grasslands, and abundant flora, with 30% of the world's mineral reserves and around 60% of its untapped arable land. Africa is the second largest continent in the world with a total area of around 11 million square miles. But despite all this potential, why is Africa still poor? Why can't Africa develop? And why can't Africa fully tap into its wealth and develop as a rich continent? In this video, we will be discussing obstacles that are preventing Africa from developing. Colonial Impact. Colonialism in Africa is one of the obstacles that has prevented development in Africa. From the 15th to the 20th century, European powers established control over vast territories in Africa. These colonial powers exploited Africa's resources and imposed their political and economic systems. They took over much of Africa's land for their own personal or commercial use, like mining or commercial farms, making it difficult for the indigenous to manage their resources and develop their nation. Colonialism still exerts a strong influence on Africa. Governance and corruption. Ineffective governance and widespread corruption are the major obstacles to the development of Africa. According to Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index 2023, most African countries are scoring very low, indicating that corruption is a big problem. And it's not just a small issue. It's seriously hurting public trust in government and scaring away potential investors, which is a barrier to economic growth and development. According to the African Union, corruption costs the continent $148 billion every year, money that could have been used for things like healthcare, education, and building better infrastructure. Just think about it. $500 billion is lost annually in the healthcare sector alone due to shady dealings and embezzlement. Economic dependence on natural resources. According to the World Bank, countries in Africa blessed with plentiful resources often experience sluggish economic growth, widespread poverty, and glaring income disparities compared to their less endowed counterparts. One significant hurdle in Africa's development is the volatile nature of commodity prices. Nations relying on commodities such as oil, minerals, and agriculture are subject to the unpredictable shifts of the global market. For instance, the oil crash of 2020 severely impacted oil-exporting nations, leading to budget shortfalls, currency devaluations, and economic downturns. Compounding this challenge is the dominance of extractive industries, which overshadow broader economic development opportunities. According to research by the IMF, these industries employ only a small fraction of the workforce in many African nations and contribute minimally to value addition and industrial growth. However, the issue extends beyond the industries themselves. It's also about the risk of over-reliance. The lack of economic diversification only deepens the dependency on natural resources. Many African economies find themselves stuck in a vicious resource curse cycle where revenue from extractive industries fails to trickle down into other vital sectors like manufacturing and services, leaving them vulnerable to external shocks and price crashes. Infrastructure deficit. Infrastructure is like the engine driving economic growth and development, laying the groundwork for trade, investment, and social connections. But here's the thing. Across Africa, there's a big gap between what's needed and what's actually in place. According to the African Development Bank, the continent faces an annual shortfall of $68 to $108 billion when it comes to infrastructure funding. That means roads, railways, ports, energy sources, and internet networks are all falling short of what's needed to support growing populations and booming economies. Despite some upticks in investment, Africa still falls short of the mark when it comes to infrastructure spending. The World Bank says that sub-Saharan Africa is only putting 2 to 3% of its GDP into infrastructure, which is below the 5 to 7% recommended by the AFDB for sustainable growth. Education and human capital development. When it comes to driving sustainable development in Africa, education and human capital development are crucial. But sadly, there are tons of hurdles standing in the way of quality education and human capital development across the continent. Take a look at the numbers. According to UNESCO, Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest rate of kids missing out on school globally, with over 32 million primary school-age children not getting the education they deserve. This lack of access to schooling keeps the cycle of poverty spinning and puts the brakes on social mobility. And it doesn't stop there. Over 60% of kids in Sub-Saharan Africa aren't picking up basic reading and math skills by the time they hit their teenage years, making it tough for them to find their footing in the workforce and contribute to economic growth. The obstacles to providing quality education in Africa are numerous and interconnected. From crumbling infrastructure and limited resources to cultural practices, the challenges are extensive. For example, more than 60% of schools in Sub-Saharan Africa lack basic sanitation facilities, and approximately 40% lack access to clean water. Additionally, according to the World Bank, factors such as poverty, child labor, and early marriage compel over 10 million African children to abandon their education annually, which leaves them trapped in a cycle of missed opportunities and economic hardship. Even for those who manage to remain in school, the quality of education is inconsistent. The World Bank's Learning Poverty Index reveals that 85% of children in Sub-Saharan Africa struggle with reading proficiency by the age of 10. The lack of investment in technical and vocational education leads to shortages of skilled workers. Gender inequality restricts women and girls' access to education and healthcare, hampering economic development. Human capital development, including education and skill building, is crucial for Africa's economic growth. Challenges such as limited access to education, skills gaps in the job market, and inadequate infrastructure hinder development. External debt dependency. External debt is a huge hurdle for many African nations, damaging their ability to invest in crucial development projects and keeping them hooked on outside help. According to the World Bank, Sub-Saharan African countries were carrying a hefty $744 billion in external debt by 2023. One big problem with being in the red is that it siphons off cash that could be going toward things like healthcare, education, and building up infrastructure. Governments allocate a significant portion of their budgets to debt payments, which limits their ability to invest in essential services and projects. The African Development Bank figures show that in some African countries, debt payments eat up more than 20% of the nation's income. But the pain doesn't stop there. High debt loads scare off private investors and put the brakes on economic growth. When credit agencies start giving countries a thumbs down for having too much debt, it drives up borrowing costs and makes it harder for them to get their hands on cash from international markets. That makes it tough to fund new projects and attract businesses, which ends up hurting job opportunities and stifling efforts to diversify the economy. Zambia's story drives home the dangers of getting in over your head with debt. In 2020, Zambia became the first African nation to default on its sovereign debt since the pandemic hit. A perfect storm of sky-high debt, sinking copper prices, and significant financial missteps compelled the government to seek debt relief and reduce spending, which only made life harder for everyday people and stirred up unrest. Chad borrowed $1.4 billion from Glencore. This massive debt burden resulted in debt repayments devouring a staggering 85% of its oil revenue, forcing the implementation of austerity measures and sparking social unrest. This scenario harkens back to a previous era when much of the continent grappled with overwhelming debts, prompting international financial institutions to launch forgiveness initiatives in 2005. Although these measures initially provided relief for heavily indebted poor countries in Africa, recent trends suggest a resurgence in debt accumulation. Brain drain. Brain drain is when highly skilled individuals leave their home country for better opportunities elsewhere. It's a major challenge, especially for African development. The continent faces a critical shortage of highly skilled individuals. The World Health Organization predicts a deficit of 10 million health workers by 2030. This scarcity hits hardest in low-income African countries where many professionals are lured away by prospects in more developed nations. The most devastating impact of the brain drain has been in the health sector, which is basically on life support. It has been estimated that in Sub-Saharan Africa, about 600,000 healthcare workers were serving 682 million people. In Mozambique, 500 doctors service 18 million people. Nigeria, Ghana, and Zimbabwe are also feeling the sting. Nigeria, for instance, struggles with a doctor-to-patient ratio of 1 to 5,000, far below the global average of 1 to 254 in developed nations. Over 75,000 nurses have left Nigeria since 2017, exacerbating the shortage. So, overcoming the obstacles to development in Africa demands practical policies, targeted investments, addressing governance, investing in education and healthcare, infrastructure, and economic diversification, as well as colonial masters allowing Africa to breathe. Africa can unlock its vast potential for growth and prosperity. What's your take on this? Share your thoughts in the comments below.